Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we will need to mark where all of our pattern pieces go. Sometimes I do this with colored pencils. Sometimes I do it with just a regular pencil and I just mark where the mountain is and where the sky is. So for today, I am just going to use a pencil and I'm going to mark where everything is. Okay, so this is my reference photo so I can see where everything is, and then if we scroll down we can see where all of the different pieces lay out. So we have A1, and that is right here. So this is green left. So this is going to be turquoise. So then C1 will be green right. Then we have the sky. Which leaves all of these other ones as mountains. And because E2 is very small, I'm going to denote all of these by a triangle. And then we have the B section. So these two, B1 and B4, are mountains. And then these, we have A2, A3, 4, and 5 are all this section, and they are all going to be blue. And that's going to be a dark blue. Okay, so now that we have these marked out, oh, and we have this one as sky. Is taking our reference photo and then deciding on colors. I decided on using this lovely sky for the sky because it's really loose and it doesn't matter if they get turned around, it will still read as a sky. So I think they'll be fine, and it won't matter if they're kind of in different areas. So I thought this one would be really nice for this section here that is the C1 area, and then this would be really great for A1 to have kind of those trees. So for A1 I will want to make sure that I have it going in the right direction. Then I am using this blue for the mountain, this section right here, kind of the mountainy cliff. It's in the shadows. A purple would also be really lovely, but I like this blue. And then for the turquoise, I was kind of waffling between two different colors. I thought that I had purchased a different green, but it looks like it was this lovely emerald green that I had anticipated using for the lake, but it's just going to read too grassy, and I want something a little bit lighter. So I think I'm going to use this because I think if I can get some of those paisleys in there, I don't think I'm going to do too much fussy cutting, but if I can get those paisleys, they will just kind of read as some nice waves. And then lastly, I'm going to use this winter tree fabric that will really nicely give the illusion of all of those wonderful crags and the rocks that hide snow in the winter, or in the summer rather. Where I live in Colorado, and I'm sure this is true for Banff as well, is that there are mountains and areas in the mountains that the sun never reaches, and so the snow never melts. So this is going to read really, really nicely as the craggy rocks. So as you're selecting fabrics, I would really encourage you to think out of the box on different ways that the fabric can read. Here are some other examples. I've used this for the redwoods block, and I used this tree as well. You can see here that it doesn't really matter which direction the tree fabric spaces go, because it just all reads cohesively. And then with this, even though they are rushes, it reads as needles. So when you're looking at fabric, just start to think about what fits in just a little 2 or 3 inch section, because that's about all that we'll be seeing really, and it has a whole different feel than if you're looking at the whole piece of fabric as a whole. So look at how the fabric, how it is in just a small section, and see if it reads differently than as a whole bit. So that's the rush grass is one that I'm not going to use. And then I also thought about using this green, but I thought that again it was just too grassy green, and the pine trees and shadows are not this color. So I wanted something that was a little bit more realistic. So don't be afraid to kind of go through a few different colors. Sometimes it takes me a fair bit of time to look through all of the colors that I have and think through, is this going to be the best? Then I take a step back and I look at all of the pieces together, and then I say, oh, this is not going to be a really good color. This one will be much better. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And then we'll cut apart the fabric into manageable pieces. Take some time to line up the edge of your template so that you don't accidentally cut the edge of your ruler, I'm sorry, with the edge of the template. Try to leave some room if you can with the paper and the edge of the template piece. Cut out your instructions and put them to the side. I do like to tape them to the side of my sewing table so that I can quickly reference them. And you'll see that I'm leaving plenty of space around the outside of the template. And the reason I do this is for when fabric shifts. Sometimes you might, if you trim it right along the edge right from the beginning, it becomes tricky to sew the template pieces together. So I like to use or keep as much white space as I can without having a huge cumbersome template. And I usually leave these edge tabby bits because it doesn't really matter, but sometimes with these larger ones, it helps me to visualize the amount of fabric that I need if I trim it down just a little bit. Okay, so we're going to set these to the side. I'm going to put them on my pressing mat so that I can see what fabric I need. All right, and then we subcut the fabric, same as you would with any other sewing. You want to have manageable pieces of fabric. I find that when I have lots of fabric, like a big piece like this, I'm more likely to make a mistake. So I like to break it down into about kind of about 2 to 3 inch sections, but it really depends on the size of the template that you're working with. So something like this is 1, 2, 3 and a quarter inches wide, one direction, and about just a little bit under 3.5 in the other direction. So something like this is not going to work. You can see that there's just not enough fabric. It doesn't matter which way we turn it. So we will go ahead and use this for the some of these other larger or smaller bits. And I like to save all of my scraps, not all of them. If it is obviously too small, throw it away. However, there are little pieces like this E2 section. We only need a tiny amount, so I don't want to cut a huge bit of fabric just for one tiny section. I want to use the scraps that I have. Okay, so the first thing that is absolutely most important about starting with foundation paper piecing, if you are a beginner, this is where people can have a tricky time thinking a little bit differently. They think that they have to think backwards and they have to put things together funny. And I want to remind you that when you're sewing, you always sew with your right sides together, so that when you open up the pieces that you have sewn together, so let's pretend that we have our seam here. When we open it up, we have the beginning of something beautiful. So the same thing is going to happen with foundation paper piecing. The only difference is that we are sewing along a solid line. It's kind of like sewing with training wheels, that the line tells you where your 1/4 inch seam is. So this is why I like to subcut pieces of fabric, because when you're working with something really large, it's harder to visualize where the piece is going to go. If you leave your template open like this, it's also really difficult to know where your fabric is going to go. So let's start with the first one. Let's work with the F block. And the first thing that we are going to do is, because we have to sew with right sides together, is for any of the first block that you do, the first piece of fabric that you put down on your template, you need to turn it over so that the wrong side of the template and the wrong side of the fabric match. Then the next thing that you will do is you'll put your right sides together. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the first thing that I want you to do is we're going to find a good place for this to be. The beauty about foundation paper piecing is you don't have to worry about where the grain line is, and you don't have to make things really straight. You don't have to starch it in advance. I do starch my blocks at the end, but that's just so that they lay really flat and I can piece them together nicely. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But when you're doing foundation paper piecing, don't worry about which way does this have to be. You can put it where it will fit. So the fabric should be pretty side down or right side down. Wrong side is facing up, and the wrong side is touching the wrong side of the template. That's how you know that you have the first one correct. So we'll turn our template over and we'll put some glue. This is also really a game changer for me when I discovered that using just a little bit of glue, and I just use Scholastic glue stick. I get it when the school supplies are on sale in the summer. I stock up on them for the year, and I have a really nice fresh supply for the whole year. When I learned that gluing down the template to the fabric for the first piece eliminated any shifting, then I could line up my pieces and they were exactly where I wanted them to be, and then I didn't have pieces shifting, and I didn't miscut, and I didn't mis-sew. So if I can impart some wisdom to you, it would be to get some glue sticks. And my preference is the clear or the white. It dries clear because the purple glue doesn't hold as well and it tends to burn the fabric, and I don't really care for it to burn the fabric. Okay, so all I have done is just cut this into a manageable piece. So you can see that the pretty side is facing up and the wrong sides of the template and the fabric are touching. Now what I'm going to do is line the edge of my ruler up with the sew line, and I'm going to score it. I'm not going to use my thumbnail to have a really tight score. I don't want to do anything to reduce the integrity of the paper template. So the next thing that we will do is line the dotted edge of the ruler. I find that this edge of the ruler is exactly 1/4 of an inch, and the other side of my ruler is not. So test your ruler, see if it's the same or if it's different. But I always use the same edge of the ruler to do all of my cutting so that all of my seams are all the same size, and they all match up really, really nicely. This becomes really important when you're cutting the edges of your template to put them together. Okay, so we have the mountain. So the next piece that we are going to put together is the sky. And so what I'm doing here is I'm lining up the second piece and all of the other pieces that fabric that we'll be putting on after the first one are all going to go face up. So right sides always go together. There's no magic, no funny math. When you sew, you want to have your right sides both facing in the same direction. So if you take just a minute to make sure that your right sides are touching and folding over your template along the area that you are going to be adding. So we already have F1 in this section, and we are going to be adding the next piece. So by folding it over, this is where the fabric needs to be so that when you open it up, just like you're opening up the template here, the fabric will end up over here. If you're doing something like this, lining up this side, then when you sew, you only have this tiny little bit to fold over, even though your right sides are together. So I'm looking to see if the clouds will go in the direction that I want them to, and I think it'll be okay. It won't really make that big of a deal, but so the right sides need to be facing. Fold the template over on the bit that you're going to be attaching. Make sure the raw edges are matching because that's your 1/4 of an inch seam. And I like to pin these because I chain piece a whole bunch of the templates together, and I don't want them to get lost. The other thing that happens is there's just a little bit of a lip where the edge of my table meets up with the throat of my sewing machine. And what can happen if I don't pin these is that this little bit of fabric will fold over like this, and then it doesn't sew properly because I've already cut into this seam here. So I like to pin at least the beginning, and I try to do the end so that I have a nice flush edge. So let's sew these together, and then we'll go ahead and chain piece the rest of them together. But I want you to get an idea of how I do this. So the next thing that you're going to do is you'll lower your stitch length from, usually it's about 2.2. You'll lower it down to about 1.4 to 1.6. I'm using a 1.6 millimeter. And make sure that the needle is in the center of your presser foot, and you're going to take a few stitches from before where this joint is, just a few before, and then you're going to go just a few stitches after. You don't need to back stitch because the stitches are so much shorter than they would be with, you know, sewing a quilt block or a garment or something like that. So you don't need to do any sort of back stitching. You can if you want, but it's really not necessary. And then we're just going to sew right along that solid line. Okay, so this should be what you have. Just nice, straight stitches right along that solid line. And you can see that this is the 1/4 of an inch right here. So again, it's might seem like it's funny math, but it's really not. So I like to set the seam and then roll it back. And give it just a little bit to cool down. And then for the last piece, I'll talk about this later as we get some other pieces going. I like to put just a little bit of glue on the corner. Again, it keeps the pieces flat. It keeps the fabric where it is supposed to be. And then I'm going to trim this because there were only 2 pieces of fabric that needed, or 1 seam rather, 2 pieces of fabric that were sewn together. I line up the 1/4 of an inch dots with the solid 1/4 of an inch line here. I call this the danger zone. So I don't use the edge of my ruler along the dotted line. There's so many reasons why. One of the biggest is that if you cut into the danger zone, if you will, and you don't have that any longer, let's see, I probably have one that I have cut in just a little bit. I don't on these, but if you had cut part of this dotted line off accidentally when you were cutting in between the template pieces, then you don't have anything to use on the side here. I also liken it to when you're cooking or baking and you need liquids and you look at the side of your measuring cup to see where the water is. You don't look at it from the top because you don't know where it is. It becomes really tricky with these to see where is the template dotted line. So just to make things absolutely easy, because we want to conserve as much brain energy as we possibly can, it's easiest to just use this solid line as where your basis is going to be for cutting around the outside of the template, rather than using the outside of the template, if that makes sense. I hope I have clarified that and I didn't muddle it for you. So I'm just going to trim off the extra tabs, and I can hold it up in the air because I have already trimmed the outside, or I've glued down the outside of the template, so it's nice and firm and it's not going anywhere. So we're going to set this down. F1 is done. Now I'm going to set up a whole bunch of these templates, and then we're going to chain piece them because it's so much easier to do that instead of going through one at a time, but I wanted to show you just that one. So we're going to go back over to these pieces and we're going to subcut some of these. Okay, so put the right side of your fabric face down, and we need to make sure that it's going in the right direction. We want our trees to be right side up and not upside down. So one thing that it's really good to get in the habit of doing is when you are setting the first piece to put the right side down, because you might be tempted to have the right side up and you say, oh look, I have plenty of room, and then you cut your piece here, and then on this way, if you've cut it here, it won't fit. Even if you rotate it, it won't fit because you've used the wrong side. So I just kind of go through and think, where am I going to be using the least amount of fabric? And I can see that I only need this to go about 1/4 of an inch over here and over on the side here and down here. And then I can even move this up because I only need 1/4 of an inch from A2. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the back. And then we will cut this out. Okay, so we want to score the line between A3 and A1 because we're going to think ahead just a little bit. I don't need to have all of this extra fabric, and I've noticed that when I do have extra fabric, that's when I make a mistake. And I've lined this up with A2, but I want to make sure that that's scored and trim off what I don't need, because I really don't want to have excess. That's probably splitting hairs, but all right. So then we use the right side up for all of the pieces after the first one, and we will line up the edge, the raw edge here, and then make sure that when the template is folded over, I'm going to color this in just a little bit. This is where A3 will be stitched to A2. You can see that line right here. So when it's folded over like this, I need to make sure that I have 1/4 of an inch from the next sew line. And I can see that I have plenty. So this will be perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in here. And we're going to move on to the green right. Again, we put pretty side down, and we kind of think through, where can I put this where I would be using the least amount of fabric. So just to help me visualize where the edge is, I'll cut this down. And I'm going to score this again so that I can see where that 1/4 of an inch is going to be. And then I can move this around as I need. See, if I would move this all the way over thinking, oh, I need to be over here, I would have all of this section here that would not be covered with fabric. I can feel with my finger that there's not enough fabric. But over here where the template comes, this is going to be the 1/4 of an inch sew line to the next template, and I only need to have 1/4 of an inch on this side. This is a perfect place for it to be, so I'm going to put some glue right here. And again, I'm going to cut just a little bit larger than the template, just in case the fabric shifts. I have a little bit of wiggle room. All right, trim off the scraps. And then the next piece I need is for mountains. And I'm going to talk through fabric fitting. You might think, oh, this will surely work. Surely it will work. And yeah, you could probably fudge it a little bit, but one of the biggest things is that there isn't going to be enough covering the edge over here, and it's cutting into the selvage. So let's take a slightly larger piece. And here's the edge of the template. I'm kind of splitting hairs here. And it's a little bit closer than I would prefer. Even though the fabric extends where I need it to, I have plenty of fabric down here and plenty of fabric over here. It's just cutting it a little bit close on this side. So when you have your template folded over, I think I mentioned this before, if it's open like this, it doesn't matter what's over here. It just doesn't matter. This is where I like to have a subcut of fabric because it makes it just so much easier to think through. So when your template is folded over, this is where you need to make sure that your fabric is going to be within this section here. If you have fabric that is coming over here, you know, outside of this area, you know that you have plenty of fabric. And I can see that I have just a millimeter, maybe less, a hair between these two. So if it shifts at all, I will still have plenty. So I'm content with this. And I will pin it and add that to my pile. Okay, we have another little mountain piece. And my fabric for the first piece, for D1, is wrong side up, and the wrong side of the template is touching. I'll put some glue in that section, in the D1 section. And then that's going to be stuck. It'll be held really well. And then I will score the sew line. Line up the edge of, or the 1/4 of an inch marking with the folded edge of the template, and then cut off the excess. And I'm looking for a little sky, so I need to subcut some of this, and I know that I will need a fair bit. So I have some that I want to try to get kind of a general direction going. This is a loose fabric, so if they turn out the wrong way, it'll still be fine, but in general. So what I do is I take a look at the widest piece, kind of like I did with the F1 mountain piece. And I can see, you know, this is upside down, so I need to turn my template so it's going the same direction again, so you don't get confused. So if you want your fabric to be facing in, you know, laying in the correct direction, like this, we kind of want our clouds to be facing in an upward motion. I mean, this fabric is really loose, so it probably doesn't matter, but if we can try to make it work, let's do it. So what I'm going to do, I'm a lefty, so that's why I had it upside down so that I can cut. I'm going to turn this around so that the template doesn't move and I can lay it down. But if you are a righty, it will probably be just as easy for you to have it the other way around. And I'm giving myself room on either side of the paper template, again for shifting, maybe, you know, mistakes happen. We're just human. Even if you have been sewing foundation paper piecing for years and years and years, mistakes can still happen. Okay, so we have, I'll turn it back around so we have the clouds going in the direction that we want and template in the direction that we want. So flip your fabric so the right side is facing down because this is the first piece for the template. Put some glue on the back. And because we've already lined up and cut it in the right direction, I know that if I have these, the outside, this is the top of the block, and then this makes about a 90-degree angle. If I have those lined up, then the rest of it is going to be the way that I want it to be. Score the sew line. And then just with this little scrap, I'm just looking to see where the best use. Here, this is one that hopefully you'll be able to see that it's cutting in to my danger zone a little bit more than I prefer. So I'd like to go over that area, have a little bit of overage. Give that a pin and then set it to the side. Okay, so we've already done F, and we can go on to B. So we'll be working with this section right here first. And we're out of we have it over here. Well, it's not that big of a deal. We will just cut a little bit over here. Generally what I like to do is I like to cut strips, and I have my strip over here. Actually, I think what I will do is I'm going to sew that really quick so then I'm not using a lot of extra fabric that I don't need. So I'm just going to sew the line between C1 and C2. Okay, then I press and then I trim. So I always have the same order of operations. And when I have the same order of operations, I tend to not have as many mistakes, which is kind of funny because I don't have order in most other areas in my life. I kind of fly by the seat of my pants. But if I have some order to this, then I'm less likely to make mistakes, and then it's not frustrating. It always becomes frustrating when, you know, the things aren't going together really well. So we'll line up the 1/4 of an inch with the solid line and cut around these. And as you're turning it, if you feel the fabric lifting on the corners, that's where you want to have just a little bit of glue to hold that down. So then we can trim up these tabs. Right here. Okay, so we'll set this over here to the side. Now, I thought that we had already done this for D. Maybe I didn't get D all set up. Okay, so let's talk about this one really quick. I can see that my template, this is another reason why I cut the templates down a little bit so that I can see the dotted line. So the edge of the sew line is here and the edge of the cut line is here. And one thing that you can do is put your finger over where the edge of the sew line is and just pull the template back. And you can see that you have plenty of room. So go ahead and pin that. And these clouds are probably going to be going in a different direction, and it is going to be just fine. It'll all work out. All right, so going back to the B block, turn your fabric so that it's facing down, and I'm thinking ahead. So I have B1 right here in the center, and then also B2 and B3, but I also have B4. So I'm going to think ahead just a little bit because I want to cut this down to something that, not cut it down, but fold it so I can see where this fabric is going to be. So then I can move this around and I can see that if I move it kind of over here, then I have plenty. Okay, put some glue down. It was hopefully clear. And I'm not going to be concerned about this fabric not fitting right over here because I have B2 that will be cut down. I just want to cut off this excess so that it's not confusing. But I don't really want to go over the score line too much. Okay. All right, B2 is sky. And in my little stash, maybe this might work. That might work. It's cutting a little bit close. I think I'm more comfortable with it being in this direction. So this is kind of one example that you might have been tempted to throw those away, and I like to keep them until I'm done with the blocks. I have just a little bin. One thing that I do is I have a bin for larger pieces, but then if I'm sewing several blocks together, I just keep piling them up on this little pretty dish, and these are all fabrics that I know that I've used in the past couple of weeks, so these colors I know will be going really nicely together, except for this one. That was for a different project. So these colors will be going nicely together. So if I didn't have them on my work surface, then I would just go through that little pile to see if I had anything that would work. You know, sometimes it's good to hold on to these for the tiny little detail parts that really make the whole block stand out. The details are what make the whole block as pretty as they are. Otherwise, they would be much more geometric. So in the same way that you are thinking about fabric in a different way, also think about your scraps in a different way. That you might generally throw them away. Now they become useful because it is so annoying. I've done this numerous times before where I have, you know, a block that I'm working with, and these are the first two, and I need something little, and I have not cut into the fabric yet, and that's, you know, kind of the place that I need to start, and it is just annoying when you have to cut a larger piece just for something itty bitty. Another thing that I do is I have kind of a vessel for I have all my quilts over here that I'm working on. Just a little plastic container with, again, scraps that I probably, you know, these I ought to throw out, but you know, things like this are really quite useful. So if you just have a little scrap bucket, then you might not feel so bad when you need to go through it to find something to fit. Okay. All right, I'm going to use my log clapper. It helps kind of dissipate the heat and help the pieces to lay really nice and flat. It encourages them to go in the right direction. So then they don't pop up. Now, this is something that I would not glue this right here, because we're going to be sewing several other, oh, we have this one here too. Several other pieces of fabric on top. So this is, even though it's popping up, and I would, if that is the end of what we're sewing, I would absolutely put just a little dab of glue on the back, but in this situation, because we will be sewing on top of that, I'm not even. I am going to cut this one. All right, we have that one there, and a little bit of glue, just a tiny, tiny amount. If you notice that your ruler is slipping at all, you can get some little grips for the bottom of your ruler. Have them on this ruler here. They're really nice because they just, once you put it down on top of the fabric, it grips it and it doesn't move. This one has some grips, but it almost could use some in the corner as well. But I really like it for the size. Okay, so we have this one ready. Okay, so the same method that I always use is score. Trim. Line up your fabric. Sew. And then we sew, then press, and then the same thing all over again. So it's always the same method. Okay, so we're going to cut off the excess for B4, and then we'll go back to the other side of the mountain that we need to get sewing. So we have another little mountain section for B4. I feel like a bingo collar. And this is going to be a little bit, just a little bit on the tricky side to get it where I want it to be. All right, and I'm cutting into the middle of this fabric. So I put my finger down over where the seam is going to be, and I can see that I have lots of room there. I wonder if I can move this over. It just cuts in really too much. I liked where that was before. I had quite a bit more. I also live dangerously close to the selvage, probably closer than most people. My feeling is that this part here is still usable if it's inside of a seam allowance. This part here becomes really difficult because the weaving is so much tighter. It is tight, you know, kind of in here, but if it's in the seam allowance, then I feel like it's still okay. So I'm kind of getting close to that danger zone, but I want to use all of my fabric. And I haven't had a problem with it. The only thing that I have heard, the reason people don't like to use the selvage is because it's a tighter weave and it doesn't lay as flat. And that's quite possible. If there is another reason why it's not good to use the selvage, let me know. I would be interested to know. So I'm going to subcut some of this blue fabric so that I have enough for this other area. I think what I'll do, just to make sure that I have I'll be able to use that. I want to make sure that I have enough. And I'm sometimes not always the best judge of how much I need. I think that should be okay. So what I like to do is cut wider than what I know I will need because of seams and the way that it needs to be folded and all of that. Sometimes, you know, it just doesn't work out quite as anticipated. But if you're cutting larger than what you need here, then you should have plenty of fabric. Okay, we'll get a 3 lined up. Okay, pressing this section over here. Pressing the B section as well. I did not think about this one here. I need a little bit extra of the blue. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Nope. Nope, nope, nope. Okay, because this is the last piece that I need to sew on this one, I'm going to break my subcutting rule, and I'm just going to go ahead and pin that score between A3 and A4. And then trim off this excess, and there should be enough here. Yeah, I've got plenty. And this is a place that I would not fold it over and trim because you run the risk of cutting seams that you did not intend. So if you are not following my suggestion of subcutting your fabric, then I hope you will really heed my warning about making sure that you press then trim instead of trim then press. I want you to really enjoy paper piecing, and you might even find a method that works better for you, and I would love to hear about it. I always love hearing about new techniques and new methods, anything to make sewing and creating easier. And I feel like when I have when I get into a groove of doing the same thing, then I enjoy it so much more. I know that I have plenty here. I was just seeing if I could move it in a different direction. Oops. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing, because I have plenty of fabric here, is I'm going to be cutting off this excess here that I don't need, and carefully cut between the two. If you feel like you won't be able to be careful, then move your template. But if you line up here where it needs to be cut and then move it off to the side, then you don't miscut anything, and then you can line it back up. So we can talk about wiggly lines. Sometimes it's tricky to stay on the lines. So long as you are really close, when the seam that you've just sewn meets the next, you should be okay. And I mean the next as in the last template piece, or the last seam before you sew them together, if that makes sense. So if we were sewing, we don't sew these together, but if I was sewing these two together, I would want to make sure that these two sections I had sewn really close to this area here and this area here. I'll show you as I put them together so that that makes a little bit more sense. And then it's not clear like mud. I want it to be clear, clear. Okay. We are done with all of these. I'll just need to get a little bit of the turquoise ready. But can you see, because I pressed first and then I'm going to come in and trim, that I have removed room. I don't have error. I'm only cutting off exactly what I know that I want to be cutting off, because it's already pressed open. I noticed that if I do the press, trim, then press, the way that you shouldn't be doing it, is just little bits of fabric get stuck underneath of the template, even though you're being really, really careful. And then here, this is an example. It just gets caught, or it didn't get caught under the scissors, so it didn't get trimmed. So you can either trim too much or trim too little, and so press, then trim. I don't need to sew that. This can go over here. And then for your last piece, just put a little bit of glue down, and this one is popping up, and this one is popping up, so I'm going to trim these, and then I will revisit the glue situation. I joke that it's like kindergarten. Paper and glue. Okay, so these are kind of starting to lift a little bit, definitely this one. So this, I'll put a little bit of glue. I think these should be okay, so I will leave that. And I'm going to save the turquoise until the end, because we don't need that until the end. All right, so put your puzzle pieces back together. And be sure to refer to your, oh, I need to trim this one, your instructions on which you should sew first. So in the instructions we have E to F. So we're going to take E to F. So you can see that it's already started to shift, so I'm going to put a little bit of glue here so then they become one. And then it really helps to put the next pieces together. Okay. And I want this to go a little bit faster, so I'm going to skip ahead to C and D. Those are the next ones because the instructions say to set aside when I am done with E and F. So that means that I can do C and D together because those will also be set aside so that I can sew the next ones. And I like to take still a few stitches beyond, so then it holds it where you want it to be. Okay, the next thing that I do before I press is I remove the tabs or your seam allowance or the danger zone. And I'm going to remove this little section of E. Make sure that you keep E1, it's glued down so it should be fine. You know, reason number 572 why I use glue, because then you can remove the tabs and it stays together. It really helps maintain the integrity of the piece of paper. So remove these, and then what will happen is that they will become nice and flat. And then the blocks go together a little bit easier as well. So I'm going to remove F2 as well. If it's about a 1/2 inch or smaller, and it is right next to the seam allowance, I like to remove it once the seam is sewn together. I don't remove them before because I need to have that to line up to the next ones. So even though my workspace is going to get a little bit messy, it kind of is a little bit messy, I just throw them off to the side until I'm all done. Because I don't need to trim anything. Well, the turquoise I need to do. Okay, then we're going to press these open. I like to press these seams open because the other ones have all been pressed to one side. With these smaller blocks, I find that it's easier to press seams open as I can. It removes bulk. Come on, open up. All right. So the next thing the instructions say is that we are going to take EF to B. And we have those right here. So what we're going to do is line up the top edge and give that a pin. I'm going to take this out and I'm going to double check. Actually, that's that one down there. It should be fine, but I always like to double check because this is, so when I was saying earlier that you want to make sure that your seams match up, if my seams don't match here, and they do, what I would do is I would move my template pieces so that the seam that I have here would be what matches, and I would rather have the top of the block need to be, you know, kind of eased into the next one, or, you know, have to sort it out in the seam allowance so that the inside of the block looks the way that I want it to look. Because we've spent all of that time sewing straight, learning a new technique, we want it to look a certain way. So, you know, that's why you have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It will allow you to move just a little bit. Generally, you don't need to move too terribly much. That's why, you know, you make sure that when you're sewing, that the when you get to those joints, that they match up as close as possible. All right, so this is one little section that I'm going to remove, and then I'm going to press these seams open. Okay, so then we have A that will go to B, E, F. B as in boy. Like this. See, and those came together really, really nicely. And this area down here needs to be where they match. And I've gone over just a little bit, so just take some time to line them up. Put your fingers in the seam allowance area. Taking the extra time to pin these together really helps as well. Okay, so I was going off the side just a little bit. So then I just steered my sewing back to where it needed to go so that those pieces met up. And that looks great. It's a really nice seam there. Remove the tabby bits. All right, and I'm going to remove A4 because that seam is sewn, so I don't need that one anymore. And I'm going to do A3, and if A2 comes out, that's just fine. I also don't remove all of the paper. We've got better things to do than remove all of the paper. I figure that it comes out in the wash anyway. It'll just dissolve. If you get 90% of it, you'll be just fine. And sometimes I let the template pieces dictate which way the seams are going to go. So this one says to press the seams open, but because there are so many seams that are all coming together, it has kind of decided that it wants to go in one direction. So we will let it. Okay, the last bit for the top. And we do have a seam here that we need to pay attention to. So kind of line up where they should go. Generally speaking, the points should be around, and they should somewhat match. This one here is meeting about this point here, and I don't worry about it so much because I'm generally not super exact in how these are cut. This is why I rely more on what's going on inside of the block. I think that'll be just fine. So I'm going to keep my fingers here, and then I will pin. And if you're a righty, then you'll just do this opposite. Okay, remove the tabs. And here's a really nice example of why you want to have plenty of fabric. It's a good thing that I had a nice amount of fabric here because there's nothing here. I have just a little bit here, so it's enough to hold it in place. So definitely pay attention when you're setting up those first few pieces that you don't cut off too much. I like removing these seams because these get to be so annoying once you have, if you leave them in. Let's see, which way does this want to go? Maybe we'll just lay that flat. Because then those papers don't always want to come out. So we'll give this a really lovely press, put that on top, and then we're going to cut the green fabric. And I already cut out a little bit. We'll just go ahead and flip this over the right way. Put some glue. On the back. Now that that is more manageable, we'll go ahead and cut this down. Sometimes with these larger pieces, a single piece, especially one that is on the outside, because there's so much more shifting that can happen, I don't always cut the bottom edge. And one of the big reasons is when you fold it over, the fabric, you know, and the paper shift. So it's nice to have a little bit of extra just in case there's any sort of moving. I'm not super concerned about it for this block, but that's just kind of my general practice, is to leave the side edges open, and then I just place a pin generally where the seams are supposed to be, and I check on the other side. But for this one, oh, isn't that just so pretty? It's just turning out so nicely. All of the details come together. Okay. So this time I need a little bit of easing. So I like, if you have any pieces that need to be eased, I like to have the bulk on the bottom, so then it can just kind of distribute all of the fabric along the top. It can stretch out a little bit more. If you do it the other way, then you might have a pucker. So if you have just a little bit that needs to be eased, you can do it. Have the bulk on the bottom. The other thing that I like to do is I like to remove all of my papers, and then I just give a light starch. And I do that before I join the blocks together. Again, because of the bulk. You know, your piece might be just the right size, but when you have several pieces all together, it might not come together quite as you'd like. So for the sake of this video, I'm not going to starch this one. I'm not going to remove the papers, but just know that that's something that I do for all of my blocks before I join them together. It just makes them really nice and crisp. They lay flat. I also do it before I photograph any block. I remove all of the papers. Like you can see this one, I've removed all the papers, and it just lays so much flatter than this one. This one has the seams that are just trying to pop up. So great job. Thank you for sewing with me. You've done a fantastic job. If you would like to get this pattern, or if you would like to sign up for the monthly subscription and you get 3 patterns a month, you can check out the description box. I will put a link to this pattern and to the monthly subscription. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.